This much. Okay, just a little background on me. I am a project manager at Oomph & Providence. I work with delivery and retainer clients on Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 sites. I actually came to Oomph as an SEO specialist, and more recently I've become a bit of a GDPR consultant, I guess is the best word, and I actually really enjoy doing Drupal config when they allow me, even though I'm a project manager. And quick note, Oomph is hiring right now. We're a super fun company to work for. You can go to oomph.is/hiring. We're always looking for good talent, so reach out. It's a great company to work for. Okay, so first a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. My recommendations here are not a replacement for any legal counsel, so if you have questions after the fact that I can't answer, recommend talking to a lawyer. Just letting you guys know. Okay, first a joke. I start all of my internal meetings with a joke, so why should this be any different? So, did you guys hear about the strawberry that was crying? His whole family was in a jam. It's about what I expected. Okay, so quick overview of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to give a quick overview of the General Data Protection Regulation. We're going to discuss, what these regulations mean for US-based companies in actuality. We'll discuss how you can build a website with an enhanced privacy experience. A lot of the meat of the talk is going to be on that. We'll discuss how you can use Drupal to continually improve your compliance, and there are going to be some good and bad examples of compliance peppered throughout. So keep an eye out for those. And for anyone who wants to view these slides after the fact, here are all my links to the important slides. If you don't want to have to scroll through 50 slides, you can just click these and get into the good ones. Okay, so let's discuss a relatively quick overview of the General Data Protection Regulation. So, GDPR, this is the exact definition, I'm just reading it off, is a legal framework that sets guidelines for the collections and processing of personal information of individuals within the European Union. It was activated on May 25th. If you don't already know what it is by now, good thing you're here. Quick note about it, this law covers all EU citizens regardless of location. So if anyone in this room is an EU citizen, you are still technically, you have the same rights as if you would have if you were over in Europe. And here's the link if you want to actually read the law in its entirety. It'll put you right to bed. Okay, so this is the first slide I copied from MediaCurrent. There are 5 distinct roles within GDPR. First is the data subject. That's all of us. Anyone who is having their data tracked by any tracking snippets that you see on websites, we are all data subjects. We all have now certain rights that the other roles have to abide by. Next is the processor. So that's the person or company processing your data. Think Google Analytics, third-party marketing sites. Now I'm going to jump across to controllers. So a controller is a person or a company who is determining the need for processing the data. So that's probably most of us in this room as people who manage websites. We are controllers. We have to determine the need is this relevant to tracking or not. Next, there's a data protection officer. So this is a required position in all organizations where you have to be compliant. Your organization should have one of these. We have a designated security officer at Oomph Inc., and we just kind of lumped it onto his role. So that's essentially if push comes to shove, someone is responsible. And last are the authorities who will actually levy the penalties if an EU citizen files a complaint. For example, it's the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK and CNIL in France. There's a bunch, every nation has their own. And there is an EU broad one, but users are supposed to file complaints within their member state. Okay, now I'm going to try to go through this quickly. Here are the user rights and requirements. And so the first is a breach notification. So that means is if a website suffers a breach, the controllers or the processors have to notify all of the individuals who are impacted within 72 hours. That is a hard and fast rule. So if you ever suffer a breach, where user data is compromised, you have to reach out to all those users within 72 hours. But there are two big exceptions to this. The first is that if there's no risk to the rights of the individuals and freedoms, then it's fine. Say you didn't lose any PII or PCI data, it's just totally anonymous data, that's fine. Like if your Google Analytics got hacked for some reason. And if you're utilizing technical protections for data such as encryption, that's how the big companies get away with not telling people that they've had a data breach for months at a time. Right to access. Data subjects have the right to access their personal data that an organization is maintaining on them. This includes third-party data, so if they reach out to you, they want to know, hey, what are you tracking on me? You need to be able to provide it. And essentially being able to provide this will help create a better privacy experience, which we'll talk about later. The right to have your data erased. If a data subject, if any of us say, our data is no longer necessary to your business, you can have that erased. You have to file a complaint for a good reason. So say, yeah, like if it's no longer necessary, you bought a sweater from J.Crew 2 years ago and they're still spamming you with emails, you can get off that list. Think of like unsubscribing. If the company has violated any laws, you can have their data erased. Think Cambridge Analytica is a good example. Or illegal processing of data. If the company has tracked your data without your consent, you can have them erase it. If you're an EU citizen, of course. But perhaps it may come here. We'll talk more about that in a second. Data portability. So you have the right to transfer personal data from one organization to another. So say the data from this company is being stored on a server in Dallas, Texas, and you want it moved to Amsterdam. User has that right, and the companies have to comply within a reasonable amount of time, which is kind of a gray area. It's subject to whatever you want. The next one is probably the most important one, privacy by design. So that is that there's data protection and privacy should be designed and implemented into all systems and software throughout the project lifecycle. So you should be thinking about how you can accomplish this when you're building new websites. If you work at an agency, if you have a current website and are considering a redesign, this is something that you should be thinking of from day one. And then finally, the data protection officer. So that's a required position. This is actually required if in government authorities and private sector companies whose core operations involve monitoring individuals, so healthcare. Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, they have to have data protections officers on hand. So this is a lot to comply with, and so what? What if you don't comply? Why should you even bother? This is a lot of effort. You can be fined up to 20 million euros or 4% of your global annual turnover, and the fines can be levied on the controllers and the processors. So say if your company violates if a company that you work for, you're an agency, you manage a website for another company that suffers a data breach, the agency can be liable for this as well. And 4% of global annual turnover, so if you're in the billions of dollars, of value, that could be a lot of money. Okay, not trying to scare you. Essentially, the EU is looking for sites that have gross negligence of the law, that just do not care about anything. If you are making changes and you're kind of acting in good faith right now, you should be sufficient. They're not going to come knocking for you. And we'll actually get to some individual cases in a bit, but the gist is you really need to mess up in order to get fined, and you'll see why. Okay, so what do these regulations mean in actuality for US-based companies? Let's look at two examples, which we actually at UMP have a little experience with. So the first one is, say you're a Massachusetts-based nonprofit. You have one office in Boston. All your contact forms are basic. You only have donation all calls to action are donation related. They go off-site to like a Kindful or something like that. You're not maintaining any individual's PII or PCI yourselves, and you're using the only data tracking is the basic version of Google Analytics, and you haven't added any custom dimensions or anything like that to make it personally identifiable. So what should that company do? So that's example one, and we'll get to in a second. Example two, say you're an international corporation and you have offices in Boston and Munich. Say 50% of your traffic is US based, but you have 35% of traffic is based in the EU. You have e-commerce on your site because you sell products to people across the world, and you have multiple third-party integrations with marketing software. Maybe you've souped up your Google Analytics with custom dimensions, and so there are multiple ways that you can reasonably identify a user. So how compliant should each of these websites be? Okay, so the nonprofit, they should update the privacy policy, notify users of changes. Those should have been completed by now. I know we all received about 1 million. We have updated or made updates to our privacy policy emails. You should add an on-page notice to talk about anonymous tracking and just say, hey, we have cookies on our website. They are essential cookies. They're used for anonymous data tracking. We don't track any personal information, etc. And you should have a privacy policy or a privacy officer. So someone in office, data protection officer, who's just, the buck stops here in case anyone comes knocking. You don't need to do anything too crazy if you're a small website like this. Essentially, all you have to do is be able to defend yourself in court and make a good argument that you are compliant and that you are working towards compliance. Especially if you don't have the resources to be totally compliant, they're not going to, again, come knocking for your head. But if you're this international company, you need to do everything that the first company has to do, and you should wrap all trackers in an if wrapper so nothing fires unless the user has explicitly opted in to consent. You need to add notice to users on all forms. The point of this is, say if a user fills out the form and then their data is, if they have not opted into data tracking, if they fill out that form, they will be automatically added to Marketo or Salesforce software. They need to know that when they fill out this form, that's what's going to happen. So there has to be a notice on all forms. You should have your developers, create a system that complies with the data rights. So data access, data portability, data erasure, getting rid of everything. You need to have a system in place that you can comply with all of the laws, and you need to create a good privacy experience so users can have the same experience opted in and opted out. So those are the basic requirements. You can see how they will vary for each company. So it's not so much black and white, it's a lot of gray. So exactly. So it's kind of unreasonable to expect a small nonprofit to have the same resources as a multinational corporation to make all the changes. However, all should be making an effort. You want to improve your privacy experience, which again we'll talk about in the next section. But as long as you're making a good effort, the EU authorities are looking for gross negligence of the law. They're looking for actions or lack thereof that pave the way for a data breach. If you are careless or ignorant about these rules when you should know better, that's how you get in trouble. So a good metaphor for US citizens is paying taxes. We all do it. The IRS isn't going to hit you over the head with a massive fine if you make an error because you didn't know better and you made a simple, honest mistake. They're not going to really come knocking. But if you blatantly disregard the law and say, screw it, I do not want to pay any taxes, come get me, they're going to come get you. Okay, so here are a couple examples of who's gotten in trouble so far. So this company, BT, British Telecommunications, was just fined £77,000 by ICO in the UK because it sent nearly 5 million emails to customers without consent. They blatantly didn't care about users opting in, and they failed to take any reasonable steps to prevent this violation, so they got in trouble. Another big one that happened in the UK is Yahoo was fined £250,000 after their systematic failures put customers' data at risk. And this is actually related to the breach that they suffered in September of 2016 that they didn't let us know about until over a year later. And so this is an interesting one because this sets a precedent that if something occurred prior to May 25th, 2018, you can still get in trouble for it if you have not made reasonable updates and have tried to improve your security and data privacy. And the last one, this was, I think, this past week, the Optical Center, which is a company in France, was fined by the CNIL Not going to try to say it, it's French, for failing to secure any data. And so when they had a breach, they lost health data for their customers. So that was PII and PCI data, and obviously health data, which is a really bad thing to lose. Okay, so now we've discussed, why you can get in trouble, and I've talked about how you should have a good privacy experience. So let's talk actionable steps about what you should do to build a website with an enhanced privacy experience. Okay, so what is a privacy experience? We already build sites with user experience in mind. This is designed for Drupal after all. I'm sure there are a lot of designers and UX designers specifically in here. And so we now need to build websites considering the privacy experience, and the pillars of it are transparency. Users need to know what you are collecting about them. And by the way, this goes for all websites across the web, not just, you can't just say, we're all US based, I'll make these minimal changes. This is what you should strive for, this is what you should work towards. Users need to know what you are collecting about them. So first is the transparency. Users need to opt in to have their data collected, so you need consent for everything. There should be an understanding that when I give you my data, that you have sufficient protections in place. Good metaphor for this one is, you wouldn't put your money in a bank that you didn't trust. If you thought they were going to lose your money, you wouldn't give them your money. So why are you giving websites your data and allowing them to track you if you don't trust them? Then intelligent collection of data. Essentially, controllers and processors shouldn't collect more than they need. If you're a nonprofit and you don't need a ton of information, you don't need to track ad behaviors. It's pointless. And users have the right to understand that, this small nonprofit or, this company is not tracking everything about my life. Leave that for Facebook. And then security and privacy by design. So again, websites should be built from scratch with all of this compliance in mind, and you should be thinking about how you're adding the trackers in, how everything's firing, and how you're designing everything. Gone are the times, recently, at our agency, we'd work on a website, and a week before launch, we would just be loading all the tracking scripts into the header and be like, all right, cool, you want Google Analytics, you want Marketo, you want this, you want Hotjar, cool, let's just add them all to either in the header or Google Tag Manager. You can't do that anymore. You need to really be considering this from day one. Okay, so here's a pretty interesting chart of trustworthiness from the Edelman Trust Barometer. They release a report every year that just outlines the trustworthiness of companies and organizations across the world. And so this chart I thought was particularly interesting because this goes over who are the most trustworthy spokespeople, the most trustworthy representatives of companies. So technical and academic experts were rated the most trustworthy, whereas government officials were labeled the least trustworthy, which is kind of interesting. So what can you gain from this chart? It can be valuable, maybe you should create a video that has a technical expert, put that on your privacy policy page explaining what you are tracking, why you are tracking it. This could be especially valuable for a B2C company and trying to explain everything simply. And you want to be able to speak from a place of expertise on GDPR and data privacy as a whole. And if you do that, users will trust you more, and that's the goal. The whole point of a good privacy experience is to build trust. It's not something that you can really directly measure, but it's something that you can strive for and users will just have an understanding of. And this is another chart. This is actually from last week. There was a poll run in the Mercury News, which is in Silicon Valley. I don't know if anyone made the trip out and is actually a subscriber of that newspaper, but they ran a pretty interesting poll of, if you look at this bottom right, which companies do you trust the most with your data? Healthcare and banks were the most trustworthy. Healthcare, your insurance companies, but doctors' offices, you have to trust them with your data. Banks, kind of surprising to me at first, but it makes sense because, you wouldn't give your money to a bank you did not trust, and, hopefully they'll be sufficient with your data as well. And again, you should not give your data to a company that you do not trust. And who do users not trust? Telecom companies, Verizon, Comcast, Cox, whoever. Users I think don't trust them and don't like them as a whole. Thank you for getting rid of net neutrality. And then social media, which I thought was really interesting. Even though they had everyone's data, users do not trust them at all with their data. Yet we still, are active on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and I find that incredibly interesting. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we trustworthy? How do we build trust? And really it comes down to, you build trust with a positive privacy experience, and you can do that by being transparent with your data and educate the user, and most of all, empower the user. Okay, so let's talk about some design and how it relates to this. So this is specifically for you designers out there. It is designed for Drupal after all. So I think the goal when designing a privacy experience is leaning into GDPR, not trying to fight it. Design around the requirements. So when you're thinking about design, what's the first thing you should think about? If you have a notice on your website, it has to be accessible. All users should be able to see it. It loses all value if 20% of the population cannot read it. It becomes pointless. You should write copy that is easy to understand. Not everyone is a lawyer. So in fact, most people are not lawyers and don't understand all of that crazy legal terminology. I don't, and I've been studying this now for a reasonable amount of time. And so you need to write copy that your average user can understand. And outside of this building, we need to consider who isn't tech savvy. My mom doesn't know what cookies are. So you need to, consider the average user who may not be totally familiar with this topic and cookies as a whole. And, when you're actually writing content and how this relates, perhaps you should call it trackers instead of cookies. Users understand that trackers mean something different than cookies, which they might not have an understanding of. You must understand that consent must be given when you're designing. So how can you build this into designs? You can, use CSS to update the template files when you're designing your privacy notices, make something more visually appealing, make it stand out. You should you should create a privacy preferences page, and you should make that accessible. You should, not only accessible in terms of users being able to read it, but make it easy to find on the website. Don't just stuff it in the footer in, a tiny, 8 pixels high font. It should be very easy to find, and the users should have the reasonable understanding that when they go to the page, they should be able to find everything that you're tracking about them. You should design a privacy preferences page. So you should, let the users opt out of non-essential cookies. You should explain everything that you're tracking, and maybe, like we were discussing that video, maybe this is something where you can leverage this, put a video on this page. Kind of my ideal scenario of a privacy preferences page is 2 of them, or you have one that is, all your legal terms, benefit, good for the lawyers, make sure your bases are covered in court, and then the simple version, the 10 bullet points that, here are in layman's terms, what we're tracking, here's how you can opt out, here's what you should know. Because the whole point is to educate and empower the user. You need to educate the user on what you're tracking about them and empower them to make a good decision. If the user wants to opt out of non-essential cookies, yes, that might affect your data in Google Analytics, and your SEO and SEM people will hate you for it, but you need to empower the user. This is about designing a good privacy and user experience. It's not just about our data. So let's actually look through some examples of good and bad privacy experience. So we'll start with the bad. This one is awful. This is Delta. And so I actually double-checked this morning just to make sure they hadn't done any changes. When I first found this was in early April, and they still haven't done anything. This is, if you pull up the Delta flight status page right now, this is what you see. This is probably the worst example from a giant company I've ever seen of good privacy experience. First of all, you have blue on blue copy for the cookie and privacy policy. You can't even read that. You have blue on blue and then a white button. It's inaccessible for just about all users. In terms of what a user should be thinking about, Delta is an international company. They should have opt-in consent. They should have a privacy preferences page. They have the resources to do all this. And in fact, if you actually get to their privacy policy page, it is one of the most difficult ones I've read, or just even skimmed through. It's not simple to understand. It's incredibly complicating for the user, I guess, kind of like, flying, but so maybe it's on brand. But that's the first bad example. And the second bad example is Tronc Media. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this company. They are a publishing company which owns newspapers like the Chicago Tribune, LA Times, Orlando Sentinel, etc. So what they've decided is, instead of complying and building a good privacy experience, they're just going to block content for all EU users. This is incredibly idiotic. First of all, EU citizens in the US can access this website. But in general, blocking content is definitely not the answer. Users should have the right to, they should understand that they can have the same opted in and opted out experience, or relatively similar experiences. And then again, blocking traffic through geofencing IPs, it's ridiculous. And it's also pretty fruitless, because one, IP addresses are constantly changing. So an IP address in France could be spun up tomorrow. That might not be blocked. And VPNs exist. So if you're an EU citizen, you can just use a VPN, pretend you're in Dallas, Texas, and fire up the Chicago Tribune. Okay, so those are the bad examples. What are the good examples that you should, even after this talk, if you want to go back to your company and say, we should do this, these are the companies you should look to. First, Acquia. I'm not trying to blow smoke here. I know they're a sponsor. I know they're a Boston company. I know there's probably a few people here that work with Acquia, or maybe even work for Acquia, but they've actually done a great job. So when you get to acquia.com, they have a noticeable and accessible message. It makes it easy to access the cookie policy. In fact, this screenshot right here is after you select cookie policy. And then on this page, it's easy-ish to read copy. And it gives users the preference to opt out of or enable non-essential cookies. So you have your essential cookies for things like logins, things that you actually need to. You don't want to have to type username and password every single time you go to a website. But then the non-essential cookies you don't need. Users should have a reasonable right to opt out of this, and Acquia does a good job. And probably the gold standard is MailChimp. From everything I've seen, and I've heard from inside sources at Acquia, that they actually designed their privacy preferences center around MailChimp. So if major companies are looking towards MailChimp, you should too. So this is a screenshot of their privacy preferences center. That's just a node that you can, that's an overlay and just pops up, a modal that pops up. So this privacy preference center has all these tabs on the left, and they educate the user on each cookie and empowers them to make the change. You can scroll through and say, the advertising cookies, no way, Jose, I don't want those, but performance and functionality cookies, like, okay, understandable, enable those, and you can save your preferences. The language is actually pretty easy to understand if you're reading this. It's accessible, so all users can read it. The only tiny issue is that it's not super easy to find from all pages on the website. You have to get to the privacy policy page, and then you have to click your privacy preferences center. I would love if everyone were just to add it to the navigation, privacy preferences, and then you could get to the page. But, beggars can't be choosers. So the point of all of this discussion around privacy experience is, setting the goal of what you should strive for. From an organization standpoint, you should empower your designers to create a positive privacy experience. When you're designing a page, you should be thinking about how it looks from opted in and opted out. Maybe start with opted in and then move on to opted out and say, okay, if we are removing these trackers, will this affect anything on the page? And if so, let's implement this in our designs. You should have your designers and developers work together. Can you have fun designing the banners? Can you enable them, allow your designers to, maybe design something cool? Totally should. And then you should have everyone work together to say what happens on click. So once a user opts in, cookies should then be firing. And think about things like, is the page going to reload, or can we just use JavaScript and have the cookies fire automatically without a reload? And then you should design that privacy page. That should be, we're in the middle of wireframes for a project I'm working on right now, and we're working on a privacy page. It's important for this company, and it's something that everyone should be thinking about. And maybe on that page is where you add a video explaining the cookies that you're tracking, essential versus non-essential, and maybe talking about if anything's different for opted in and opted out users, and explaining why. And then again, that's how you build trustworthiness. Think about being an academic or a technical expert on the matter. This is how you build trust with your users, and you keep them coming back and engaging with your website. So now, how can we use Drupal to continually improve our compliance and our data security? So there are 3 technical recommendations I have for you. So the first is use Drupal. You should leverage the CMS. They already have a lot of tools for you that can get you 90% of the way there, if not 100% of the way for probably a lot of companies, for whoever you work for. When we get to that, we're going to specifically discuss the EU cookie compliance module, but there are a lot of other great modules out there. Drupal has a GDPR team and a whole community that we're going to talk about in a minute. You should use if wrappers. These will become your best friends, and I'll show you a quick example of one. These if wrappers will ensure that you're not collecting any user data without consent. So again, users have to opt into data, can't stress that enough, and so you should wrap all of your tracking snippets in an if. So if a user has not opted in, you are not firing that tracking snippet. And then the final technical recommendation is kind of the top tier of compliance, the boss of the GDPR video game. And this is a single encryption key, so it's a way for you to access users' data without actually viewing it. You just have all user data stored on a server with a single encrypted key per user. So if you need to provide it to anyone, you can. And we'll get to that in a second. So, Drupal. So probably the best module I've used, probably used 3 or 4 of them at this point, but once we found the EU cookie compliance module, we didn't use any others. I highly, highly, highly recommend this module. It's fantastic. It has basic options. It has advanced options. It can help you set a cookie to track users who have opted in. It does that automatically to make sure that they're not seeing the privacy banner every time they get onto the website. You can customize the placement of the privacy notice. You can change your fonts, colors, etc. You can do a lot. And we've actually even worked with some CSS in the template file to enhance the message even further for some clients who wanted something a little more on brand. And you totally can do that. It is probably my biggest, if you have to make one takeaway from this, is install this module on your Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 sites. The next is the Drupal GDPR team. This is a team of Drupal users who are contributing back to the community and are creating tools or creating modules or adding patches to modules, are continually updating everything. And this is the pitch that, Drupal is a community. I've only been working with Drupal for 3 years now, but I absolutely love it. I love the community aspect, and I think that, if everyone is contributing back to the community, which we all should, we will create a better experience for all Drupal users. And the goal, I guess, the perfect goal is to see continuity across the web, so that if you go to any website, you can understand how to update your privacy settings, understand where the privacy settings are, and we can start with our own community to do so. And maybe then we can expand and have the browsers actually implement changes. So that's everything you can work with Drupal. And so if wrappers. So this is actually an example from one of our clients who had an interesting case study where they were using Marketo to track information, but also to fire all of their forms. And so we had to create a situation, but this actually shows an actual example of not just a code snippet of what happens to a form before and after the user has opted in. So before a user has opted in, you don't see the form. And so the code in the back end starts with false, because you have to understand that users have to opt in. So unless you have their consent, cannot fire any of these forms or tracking snippets. So you start with false, but once they've opted in, and we've added a message that says, please, accept cookies and reload the page, and then you can see the form. And once you've opted in, you can then see the forms. And again, it was an interesting case study. We couldn't use the web forms module or anything like that. So this is just a good example of how you should use if wrappers to actually fire everything. And so if you have, my recommendation is to, one, load all of your tracking snippets through a single CDN. I would use Google Tag Manager. It's free, it's simple to use. And then you can just wrap that tracking code in an if wrapper like this, and then you're covering all of your cookies. You're covering all of your bases. And of course, just make sure it's set to false automatically, because you do not have the user's consent yet. And I would say if you have a website and your privacy notice right now is by continuing to browse, you consent to our cookies. If you have a privacy notice like that and e-commerce or selling something on your site or collecting any user data, you should change that privacy notice, have users opt in, and use an if wrapper to actually wrap the tracking snippets so nothing fires, again, without user consent. Can't stress that enough. Okay, the lockbox. So full disclosure, I'm not an engineer. I have a fantastic article which I've sourced that you can, when we publish the slides after the fact, you will be able to see everything. And so the idea for this is to create a single end-to-end encrypted key for every user that can easily access all the data. Again, I have to reiterate that this is not mandatory, but idealistic. If you can set this up and you're at a small company, that's fantastic. But if you can't, that's not a big deal. However, if you work for a major corporation and you have the resources to set this up, you probably should. And so the idea is simple. You have a user comes to your website, they consent to cookies, you start tracking. And you are keeping everything locally on a server, or not on your local server, hopefully at a compliant company like Acquia or any other hosting company. And you have just a single encrypted key for all of that information. And so if a user wants to access their data, they can easily. This is actually something that MailChimp uses. If a user wants to access their data, their DevOps engineers can provide it to you without actually seeing any data. No laws are broken. It is compliant throughout. If someone wants their data erased for whatever reason, you can comply pretty easily. Again, without actually viewing any of the data. And if some sort of authority, again like ICO, comes knocking, you can provide the data pretty easily. And again, this is something that could be its own talk. There's a lot of information on this topic. So again, save time. You can this is actually one of the slides I linked at the beginning. You can just navigate here and click on the link. Okay, so what are the actionable steps that you should leave this talk and go to your company with? So for starters, there are about 1 million GDPR checklists out there. So this is just an example of something that's worked for our company and we recommend that others use, but you can totally develop your own checklist or work with any other company you want. So the first, assess your risk and write up a plan. Assess, what have you completed so far? What is left to complete? You should think about things like, where is your website hosted? Are they compliant? What are you tracking? just assess everything, log it all, and then go with, the next step is to update your privacy policies. If you haven't done this, this needs to be done. You need to add privacy notices to your website and update your privacy policy. If you have a website that doesn't have this yet, next week's a short week. Not a lot's going to happen. We're taking a Wednesday off. Nothing's going to happen during the week. You should make this a priority. And then you should prioritize your remediations. Think about what's more important, having an accessible privacy notice that all users can see, or setting up, a lockbox with a single encrypted key, a single encryption key. One is probably a little more important. You should have a banner that's accessible for all users before you, walk before you run. Then actually implement it. Plan your work, complete it, and document everything. This is really important. Whenever you're having a discussion with a client where you're talking about this, take notes. Whenever you're having a discussion internally about this, take notes, log your action items, make sure you document absolutely everything. Because worst case scenario, if there's legal recourse, and that has to come back, that comes back to you, you need to be able to prove that you have been making sufficient steps in order to comply. And then you will probably either not have to pay a fine or pay a much lesser fine. So document everything. And then rinse and repeat. This is not a one-time change. You need to be continually improving your compliance, improving your site. The bar keeps going up. The bar keeps changing. And you have to. There's going to be more laws enacted, and you need to be continually thinking about this. It's not all right. We completed all the recommended changes. Now we're done. No, you got to keep moving. And then I have a bonus action step for you. Keep up with the news. The news is ever changing, and this is a story recently that was published in Axios. May not be my publication of choice, but they had a scoop from the White House that the White House has been reaching out to Silicon Valley executives and have been discussing setting up something similar to GDPR in the US. So if this is coming in the US, you need to be aware of that. You need to make sure that you have been, compliant ahead of time. And again, that helps build your trustworthiness with your clients and customers. Okay. So when you're actually creating a plan, this is what you should be thinking about at the beginning. And actually, this is a little better of a breakdown. So you have your three phases. You have your data collection points, messaging, and then data control. So with data collection points, what are you collecting and why? Make sure that the data is actually relevant to your company. If not, you shouldn't be collecting that data. Think about active versus passive data. So you have your essential and non-essential cookies. You should also be thinking about what are you tracking that's personally identifiable information and what is not. So quickly, Google Analytics is passive data right now because you cannot reasonably identify a single user. But if you enhance it with a custom dimension or using any other third-party integrations, that becomes active data, and you should really be considering that when changing around your privacy policies and developing an actual plan. Think about where your data is being stored. Is your hosting provider compliant? It's really important. And think about any integrations. Say if you're using Salesforce. Just because Salesforce's website says they're compliant doesn't make your website compliant because you're using Salesforce. You need to be compliant on their own. These companies have made it they've announced it very publicly that they're not responsible for your, mess ups on your own sites as controllers. So then you think about messaging. If you haven't already, add your opt-in language to your privacy policies. Or add your opt-in language to your site, update your privacy policies, and then there should be internal messaging. You should let your team know that there are a lot of benefits to completing this. As someone, I love SEO. I've seen a little bit of a downturn in some data and landing page data and acquisitions simply because the data is not firing and users aren't consenting to all clicks, or users aren't consenting to all cookies, but that's okay. And you need to tell your teams that is fine, because once a user has consented and has opted in, they're already engaging with your site. They've proven that they are active on your website already, so that user is a little more valuable anyway. And that should be, internalized, and every member of the team should understand that. And then you should have your plan for user control. Make sure that the data can be moved and deleted and can be provided to an authority if it's requested. And you should make sure that a user can opt out after they have opted in. If you just click accept cookies, what happens then? They have to be able to get to a privacy preferences center and say, actually, I don't want you to track my data anymore. And users should have a reasonable understanding that they will have the same experience opted in and opted out. I know it's a lot of information. But this is pretty much it. So I'm just going to end with a quote. Data is a precious thing and will last longer than the systems themselves. Just for all of us to realize that our personal data that's on the web will last longer than the company that we gave access to it, and the data that we are collecting on users will probably last longer than our own companies that we work for currently. And it's our responsibility to manage data responsibly and to build the best privacy experience and build trustworthiness for all users. Again, special thanks to the MediaCurrent team. I couldn't have done this without them. So thank you to Don and Mark. I'll probably talk to some MediaCurrent people after this. And that's it. Thank you for listening. This was actually my first talk I've ever given, so thank you guys for joining. And happy to take any questions. Also, thank you, Jason, in the front, for helping me out. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that geofencing is pretty much useless. Could that be considered a good effort?
I would not consider that a good effort, because that's a good question. I would not consider that a good effort personally, because you're essentially blocking access to your website, and that should probably rank higher than any other form of compliance, is making sure that everyone can still access your website regardless of their location and regardless of if they've opted into tracking. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I work on a corporate website that has advertising on it, not advertising directly into users, but advertising that might follow you around from site to site. And when you, let's say, start using DoubleClick Network or something like that, there's a sort of a whole dependency tree of vendors which they invite into. So despite my best efforts, I have no idea what marketing is going to add, and the number of cookies and things is completely uncontrolled. But that's just like the way business is done, and they don't want to change that. Is there anything that I can do?
Yeah, so for starters, make sure your privacy policy is updated to reflect that and educate the users about it. And if you're using DoubleClick or ad choices or anything like that, you can actually get to an ad choices page and see on your computer all of the companies that are currently tracking you.
Right.
And that's a link that you should just provide and say, hey.
Yeah, we're actually using TrustArc.
Okay, yeah.
What I've discovered is the process is not as automated as you'd imagine. They need to scan your site and sort of certify things, but if the marketing people add a new script tomorrow, it won't even be covered by TrustArc.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Maybe go with ad choices or DoubleClick or something a little with think of the company, the companies that you're working with and integrating with. Make sure that they're accessible and that their privacy is updated too, and that they're managing data responsibly. This works, not only B2C but also B2B. Think about the companies that you work with. If they're not, you can take your business elsewhere and say, hey, you guys aren't responsible with your data. I'm going to go to someone who is. That would be my recommendation to your marketing team. That's a tough situation. We can talk after the fact. I'm happy to discuss. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Drupal module that integrates Google Analytics? I think it's just called Google Analytics.
Yeah.
Do you know if that integrates with the EU compliance module that you're talking about?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I could probably find out pretty easily after this and show you. Yeah.
Just a comment on that. I think you can adjust the settings in your own Google Analytics to be more compliant with how it tracks things.
Also true.
So you kind of don't need to integrate them that way if you have the settings correct in your
So
own.
settings in the actual Google Analytics.
Yeah, on your admin panel, if you log into Google Analytics, you'll probably have, it looks like it's a privacy notice banner, but it's actually not. And it actually is just a hot link that gets you to your privacy preferences page, which is under the property. So if you go, I love Google Analytics. So if you go to, it should be under property, and then where you have the JavaScript and the tracking ID, there should be something for privacy right there. And you can make sure that that's firing appropriately and collecting only anonymous data. Anyone else? Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. I'll be around today. So if you have any other questions, I'm happy to talk. Just hit this big button.